The Holy Gospel according to John. Now, let me just say that our text for today begins in John chapter 11 and starts with verse 34 and runs through 42. But for context sake, I want to back up to the first verse of chapter 11. So, now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped her feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent a message to Jesus, Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, this illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Accordingly, though Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, after having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to his disciples, let us go to Judea again. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were just now trying to stone you, and are you going there again? Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours of daylight? Those who walk during the day do not stumble because they see the light of this world. But those who walk at night stumble because the light is not in them. After saying this, he told them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going there to awaken him. The disciples said to him, Lord, if he's fallen asleep, he will be all right. Jesus, however, had been speaking about his death, but they thought he was referring merely to sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus is dead. For your sake, I'm glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. Thomas, who is called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, let us also go, that we may die with him. When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, some 2 miles away. And many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, while Mary stayed at home. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now, I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him. Jesus said to him, your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? She said to him, yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world. When she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary and told her privately, the teacher is here and calling for you. And when she heard it, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come to the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. The Jews who were there with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary get up quickly and go out. They followed her because they thought she was going to the tomb to weep there. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, where have you laid him? They said to him, Lord, come and see. Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, see how he loved him. But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind had kept this man from dying? Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, take away the stone. Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, Lord, already there's a stench because he's been dead for 4 days. Jesus said to her, did I not tell you that if you had believed, you would see the glory of God? So they took away the stone. And Jesus looked upward and said, Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, But I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, he cried with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." The gospel of the Lord. Well, there are many, many things going on in this chapter, and I didn't want to just pick up from where we were supposed to because we miss a lot of the context. Let's go back. It says that when Jesus was with his disciples, they had heard that, oh, Lazarus is sick. The sisters, Mary and Martha, had sent that message to Jesus. "Lord, the one that you love is ill." And Jesus said, "Yeah, this sickness," basically saying, "this sickness isn't for the glory and finality of death. No, this is for the glory of God, so that you can see it." But after he heard that, they stayed another 2 days. Hmm. I've often looked at that when I was younger and thought, why'd he hang around? Okay, he's obviously waiting for him to die so that he can show the resurrection, but by the time he gets there, it's been 4 days. Certainly one day would have been enough, right? We need to learn a little bit about the culture of the time, what first century Judaism looked like and what they believed. 2 days longer he stayed. So a part that I really love about this story is that the disciples are like, "You're going back to Judea?" Obviously, they're in Galilee. So it's a bit of a trip back. "You're going back to Judea? You're going to Bethany? They want to kill you there." He says, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep. I'm going there to awaken him." "Oh, Lord, if he's fallen asleep, he's going to wake up on his own." "Yeah, he's dead, I'm talking about." "Oh, well, that's a different story." He goes, "But let us go to him." And Thomas, the poor guy who gets stuck with the moniker of doubter, said, "Let's go too, that we may die with him." For Thomas, it's better to die with Jesus than to be left without him. Let's go. Okay, let's go and I'll die with him. I love that. So when Jesus gets there, he finds that his friend Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. It's important. That number's important. And a lot of the Jewish folk had come around, hanging around Mary and Martha, because the custom, not only in first century Judaism, but even to today in many Jewish circles, is that those in mourning don't go anywhere for a week. They would stay in the house. They would cover all the mirrors, and there weren't a whole lot of mirrors in the first century, but they do that now. And they would sit in mourning. The women would sit there and do nothing except weep. It was called sitting Shiva. They still do that. So Martha hears that Jesus is coming, and she breaks the Shiva and goes out of the house. They're not supposed to go out of the house. Is this where the custom of bringing food to a mourning family, is this where that began? I don't know. It would make sense because they can't go out and shop. They can't do anything. So people would bring food to them. So you have the kind Jewish folks sitting there with them, mourning with them, probably bringing food to them. Mary stays at home while Martha goes out, still sitting Shiva. But Martha gets to Jesus and she said, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. That's a statement of great faith. But even now, and this is kind of a little passive way of asking for a favor, but even now, I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him. Jesus says, your brother will rise again. Now, here again, we're told something about first century Judaism because she said, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. They believed that on the last day, all the righteous would rise again. So she goes, I know that's going to happen. Now, the Sadducees didn't believe that, but the Pharisees and most of the others believed on the resurrection of the last day. But Jesus said, no, 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 not talking about the last day. I am the resurrection and the life. Everyone who believes in me will never die. And those who do die will live again. Do you believe this? She goes, yes. I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God. Jesus doesn't call himself that, but she does. The Son of God, the one coming into the world. And when she said this, she hightails it back to the house to get Mary. And she said, the teacher is here and calling for you. Now, in the Jewish belief, especially here in the first century, they believed that when someone was sitting Shiva, the only one who could call them out of sitting Shiva was the husband. Now, do not think for a second that I'm proposing that Jesus was married to Mary of Bethany. The whole idea of Jesus being married, we have no evidence for and no evidence against. Anybody who says that they know for certainty that he was or was not, we don't have enough evidence to say that. There are certain external customs and things that may point to one direction or another, but I'm not going to, as they say, I'm not going to die on that hill. Still, the point here is that normally it was a husband who would call the woman out of sitting Shiva, but Jesus, the teacher, the rabbi, has the authority here. And so when Martha says, the rabbi's calling for you, Mary promptly gets up and goes to where he is. That's the kind of authority that Jesus had. Enough to break custom, enough to extend his authority to places no one had before. Well, she gets there and she says basically the same thing. Lord, you know, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Oh, stow it, Jesus says. Well, not really like that. But he says when he saw her weeping, and the Jews who were with her were also weeping, it says he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. Well, that's a fine, sentimental, soft way of saying it, but the Greek words there are more like he was agitated. The greatly disturbed, he was agitated in spirit. And then when it says he was deeply moved, it means indignant. Oh, you guys, there's an agitation there. And then it says Jesus began to weep. Again, we can't over sentimentalize it by saying, oh, Jesus is showing his solidarity with those who were grieving. No, 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 don't say that. The words there show that Jesus is upset. There's just no way getting around it. We can say greatly disturbed or deeply moved, but he is agitated and he is indignant. I've told you I was the resurrection and the life. I've told you that your brother will live again. So he starts to cry. Have you ever been so upset that your only response is just to cry? I know I have. I know that I have been so angry that the only way it could express itself, short of beating the daylights out of somebody, which I don't do, short of screaming, short of offending somebody or the risk of offending somebody with your words, all that comes out is tears. Is that what Jesus is feeling? Maybe so. I think so. So he goes, ah, just because they're saying over there, this guy, oh, hey, he loved him. But this is the guy who is, you know, cured a blind man. Couldn't he have kept this man from dying? Again, it says Jesus was greatly disturbed. He's indignant. Oh, no, this is the one that he's agitated. Sorry. He comes to the tomb. It was a cave. And this was the culture of the time, the practice of the time, was to bury someone in a cave. And of course, you roll a big stone against it, close it up so that animals can't, you know. But in the Jewish culture, they would leave the bones or the body in there for a year, wrap it up very tightly, and leave it there so that after a year, the body has decomposed, but the bones remain. And so the bones are all wrapped up tightly. And then they would take the bones and put them into big clay jars, put it in an ossuary, and then put it on a shelf that had been carved into the tomb. So the bones didn't always lay there. They were put in jars after 1 year. So Martha then said of the dead man, Lord, roll away the stone. He's been dead for 4 days. There's already a stench. Jesus said to her, didn't I tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? So they took away the stone. Okay, I told you that it was important that it was 4 days. Why? Because in Jewish belief, the spirit hovers around for 3 days. They even believed back then that they had seen miracle workers who could raise the dead, or the stories of those had passed around that the dead had been raised, but only during that 3 day period. After 3 days, spirit's gone. Jesus waits for the fourth day. You get it? So now there is no chance. Not only Jesus, the stinks, and they would have put spices in there with him, but even after 4 days, the smell overwhelms the spices that are there to anoint the body. 4 days. His spirit's been gone for a day now. There is no bringing the spirit, the soul, back into the body. It's not possible. That's why Jesus said, this is going to reveal the glory of God, because this was impossible. Not only to bring the dead back to life, but for it to be 4 days, there is no coming back. So he prays. He looks upward, which was a Jewish custom. They were looking up to God, I suppose. We kind of do the same thing sometimes. And he goes, Father, I thank you for having heard me. He's saying, you've always heard me in the past. I know you've heard me, everything that's going on here. I know that you always hear me. But I said this for the sake of those who are hanging around, so that they can believe that you sent me. Did he ask for anything really? No. He was just kind of calling on God to pay heed. and for everyone else to know that this was the power of God that was doing this. Stone's been rolled away. Jesus says, Lazarus, come out. And the dead man came out. Now, it's miraculous that a man dead for 4 days has come back to life, but the fact that he comes out when he is so tightly bound, he would have had to shuffle out. So Jesus sees his hands and feet with the strips of cloth, swaddling cloth, his face wrapped in a cloth, and he goes, unbind him, let him go. It was Jesus' words, him calling him by name. Jesus calling Lazarus by name broke the power of death. And then he tells his bystanders, cut him loose from all that. Cut off the bindings of death and let him go. This is a fine contrast for when Jesus himself comes forth from the grave, that he wasn't bound. The power and binding of death was completely broken in him. This is the good news for us. That death has lost its hold on us. Death has lost its terror for us. Later in the New Testament, we hear, grave, where is your victory? Death, where is your sting? Because the call of Christ on our lives breaks the power of death. Death is at work in us, not only just killing our bodies, and as they say, we're all heading towards death, or as Jim Morrison said, no one gets out of here alive. But death doesn't have the final word. A word about Lazarus and Mary and Martha is that after Jesus had been crucified, was resurrected, ascended back to God, they left. They took off immediately to the east, stopped off at the island of Crete, and there Lazarus began to preach the gospel. Legend tells us that he was put to death there again, and Mary and Martha continued on to what was then called Gaul, now called France, and they continued to minister in that direction. The power of death, the fear of death had been broken in all of them. It's the same for us. We die, we know, but we're promised that life is working in us. Life will have the final say. The love of God, as always, will have the final say. Thanks be to God.